One of the things I discovered as I started to work with clients in a more organic way is that if I went and looked at Milton Erickson's work, I had a completely different interpretation of things he'd say. So on the front end, I would look at Erickson's work and I would try to sort of run it through my understanding of hypnotic principle and technique. But as I got farther and farther away from that, and I became more adept at just catching trances that occurred naturally, I noticed that Erickson's actually quite direct in his explanation of things a lot of times. He might be working in an indirect way, but when he says things like confusion, it always precedes enlightenment. I think he's really just describing the learning process. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that might have a different take on it. But when you look at what he's doing and his aim, it's about the creation of choice. And that's how he would go about creating hypnotherapeutic outcomes. So it would just be through that process. So if that's the aim, enlightenment's really just starting to understand the problem differently, understanding yourself in relation to it differently. And what's really cool when you start to work in this organic way with folks, it's like it just doesn't bother them anymore. They're just kind of tired of it. So for example, like my little boy used to be obsessed with eating macaroni and cheese. So I went out and bought him a bunch of macaroni and cheese. We'd have it on hand here. And, you know, shortly after buying it, he was just completely sick of it. He couldn't be bothered with it anymore. I see this a lot of times with people I help quit smoking or whatever the presenting problem might be. So they've just learned, or they've had a moment of enlightenment. But what happened prior to that? Confusion. This is very normal. I'm sure you've experienced this in your life. You know, I see it with my kids when they're learning how to tie their shoes. It's just like the most wild thing ever to them, and then suddenly they can just do it, right? They just have that moment of understanding. So what's really cool about this is when you're working with a client now, it doesn't matter how confused they are, how lost they are. That's just the moment prior to them getting the change, getting the understanding, beginning. So you see how this is a little bit different now. When I worked in a more traditional way, I would try to sort of just read principles into it. And I'm sure that's there. And of course, Erickson being, you know, a genius would have a ton of really cool things that you could draw from his work when it comes to hypnotic technique. But he's also really interesting just to take in a very direct way, right? And if you like interpret him in a more concrete way, you can really make change work a lot more simple, because we're not looking for things that aren't necessary for people to create change. Like I don't sit around using suggestions or trying to confuse people. The client's naturally confused. So we just use their natural confusion to help them create resources organically. Right? All these things are happening within them. We have a really cool opportunity now to just explore it with them. And so this is just one of the things I discovered as I started to shift the way I work with clients. And as I said before, and I'm sure you'll hear me say it for the rest of my life, I think clients really are our best teachers. I think that some of the lessons we learn from them don't always feel good, but they're the most powerful lessons you get, right? When you really start to absorb these things. And I think one of the traps, though, is that sometimes it's hard to absorb it if we're looking at the feedback we're getting only from the standpoint of the hypnotic techniques and principles we've learned before. It's just a little harder it's like you don't really know how to filter it. You don't really know how to understand it. But you can always keep those things, all right? You don't have to get rid of those things, right? The techniques and all that. But just allow yourself the opportunity to explore the feedback from any angle that's not that lens, right? Like just really like maybe they really are struggling with the thing they're saying. Like I remember, so here's an example of that. When I worked with smokers, originally I would go through a process of getting them to think about smoking only as a habit. And I helped a ton of people with this. So this isn't a critique of that approach. However, I would run across people that were just, it didn't matter how much effort I put into convincing them or time I spent on it. They're like, no, I really feel like it's an addiction. At the end of the day, it's the presenting problem, it's the symptom. It didn't matter. Right now, I don't care what people say. They could call it an addiction, they can call it a habit. I don't care. They can call it a pink Looney Tunes 5000. It doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, their mind has the answers within them. It has the solution, it has the problem. I just want to create a space to explore it with them, right? And as we explore it, it's incredible what their mind can do. So these are the types of things that are available to you when you start to work in a little bit more organic way, and just start to introduce the stuff, start to play with it, and notice all the fun you can have as you kind of let go of certain premises that we've decided have to occur to create therapeutic change, right? We can disregard those. You can always go back to them. They're there for you when you want them. Just to summarize one more time, actually, yeah, enlightenment is always preceded by confusion. I think it's just describing the learning process. It's how you learn everything. There's always a moment of confusion because you don't know it yet. All right. And enlightenment in this case is just, hey, I've developed an understanding I didn't have in the past. I look at everything differently now. I know it's a bit simplistic, but I think a lot of this stuff really, really is. And I think learning to utilize the simplicity in its fullness, and that's going to continue to be, and you'll continue through your experience to learn more and more ways to do that. It just creates so much leverage for you. By leverage, I mean it makes things really, really easy. There's that old saying, with a big enough lever, I could move the world. This is what it starts to feel like, because it's no longer about having them meet you at your understanding or at your sort of the premises you have for what change work needs to look like. You're free to explore what that client needs. And their unconscious mind is always communicating. As you continue to develop that skill, being able to detect it, as you become aware of it and aware of all the different ways you can utilize it with that client, it's really fun. It's a really fun way to work with people. And there's no pressure on you, right? Because you're not doing anything anyway. You're just exploring, creating a space for them to explore, and you get to discover what's going on together. And it's just a neat way to see all the different things the unconscious mind does too during those experiences. So, yeah, hope that helps. All right, take care.